In the previous video, we have talked about the project preset and the input tilemap that we want to reproduce through wave function collapse. This video, we will look at read input module, which will process the input tilemap. The read input module will consist of reading tilemap and mapping tiles into integer values. So we will access the tiles by their index rather than through the tile parameters. And there is quite a lot of classes: IInputReader, IInputImage parameters, InputReader, the concrete implementation of IInputReader, IValue, tileBaseValue, tileContainer. So let's get to it. I have decided to include two helper classes in the preset project, as those two contain code from external sources. It will help with our solution, but we will not discuss how it works. We have a hashcode calculator and myCollection extension. I just want to point out that the code that we will write is an effect of iterative coding with test-driven development. It was refactored to be most readable and comply with object-oriented design as much as my skill allow me to do so. I will be creating a new tutorial that includes going from the raw code into the refactored code, so stay tuned if you're interested in this topic. First, we will start with IInputReader interface, which will abstract the whole process of reading the input, so you can implement whatever grid structure you want to pass into the wave function collapse algorithm. So let's create a new folder inside our scripts folder, and let's call it input. Let's enter this folder, and let's create new C# script, IInputReader. And let's open it in Visual Studio. Okay, first of all, we need a namespace to contain all of our classes for wave function collapse code. Namespace wave function collapse. Okay, and we need to change the class definition into interface. And we will delete monobehavior inheritance and the code inside our class. Okay, our IInputReader will be a generic interface, so we need to add a parameter t to be passed on declaration of this class, and we will create a grid to store our grid read from the tilemap or whatever source you have. It will be IValue, also an interface, and also generic. And we will store the values as a jagged array. And let's call this method readInputToGrid. Okay. IInputReader will be a generic interface that will output a grid of generic I values. We will store all the methods in a namespace called wave function collapse. Through a readInputGrid method, we will be reading the input provided by the user. We are using generic classes by applying angle brackets and a letter T that represents a type that we want to pass to our class. This allows us to use tilemap and its tileBase class, that is a base class that represents a tile, but we could also easily create an implementation that uses game objects set up in a grid, say inside a parent. And if you implement the way to read those game objects to our IValue jagged array, then you could easily use it in our wave function collapse to get the output. But before all that, we actually need to create the IValue interface. So let's do it now. Let's create a new C# script called IValue, and let's change its name with a big V, and let's enter it. I need to change the name here as well. And we need to also put it inside a namespace. Now we need to delete the methods and delete the inheritance from monoBehavior. And let's change it to interface. And we need it to take a generic parameter t. In this generic class, we will store whatever we have read through the input as a generic object, a facade, if we can call it that. This will allow us to forget about what we have read from the input, as we will be working with our own objects from now on, and thus making the wave function collapse algorithm reusable for all cases that you want to use it. It will be a generic type property value with a get method inside it. Now, to ensure our IValue concrete implementation can be safely put into collections of different types, we'll implement some interfaces that will help us create, make this value our custom class applicable for storage inside the collections. So we will implement IEquitable interface and IEquality comparer interface. We need to import system namespace. Okay, so why did we do that? Well, IEquitable allows us to use classes that use IValue interface inside generic collections such as dictionaries. Dictionary only accepts unique keys, and every time you add a new one, it compares it with all the keys it contains. Without the definition of how to compare those keys, we will not be able to distinguish between two IValue classes, because we know that they store different values, but the dictionary has no way of checking it. And that's why we need IEquitable interface, which we will implement in the concrete classes that inherits IValue type. IEquality comparer is used in a link library, a library that will allow us to query the data inside our collections. It will come handy when we want to, for example, to check if any of the cells in our output grid is not yet solved. Now, I assume you have some previous knowledge and experience in working with C#, but if something is unclear, Google it first. If still you're unsure, please leave a comment in the comment section and I will try answering the question. Okay, with those two interfaces ready, we can now create a concrete implementation of IInputReader interface. So let's create a new class called InputReader. Okay, let's open it. Okay, let's place it in our namespace and delete monoBehavior inheritance. Okay, and let's inherit IInputReader. And we will create the input reader for our tile-based class. And we need to import using Unity engine.tilemaps. And we need to implement the interfaces method. Tile-based class is a base class for a tile in tilemap. So here you have a description, and basically it has some useful methods that we'll be using for accessing the tiles. Okay, we need a private field that will store our tilemap input. Okay, and a constructor. Okay, so in our read input to grid method, we will be processing our tilemap to create our IValue jagged array. Let's implement this class and we will discuss how it works. First we will create the var grid and it will read input tilemaps. Okay, let's create this method, a placeholder for it. Next we need a grid that will store our tile bases. This will be a tile base value, a concrete implementation of IValue. We'll call it grid of values, and it will also be a jagged array. We will set it to null. And now we need to check if grid is different than null. And if it is, we can safely process the grid. So we call grid of values equals my collection extensions. And we have this in our helpers that I have pre-set for you in our preset project. And let's call create jagged array. And this method creates for us the jagged array. Now, as an example, let's see how you would create the jagged array by hand. So you would create an jagged array of integers and create a 4 rows for this array, and then you would have to create a new array for each of those rows. So it's quite a bit of code to write, and we are using this method. Let's go to the definition. This is inside our helpers folder, and this takes the generic parameter. So what type of array are we creating? So how many fields does it have? And the length as an array of integers. So let's see how to use it. To make things easier, let's change the definition of read input tilemap helper method to return tile base jagged array. Here we will pass the type of tile base value that we have created previously. And as parameters, we will pass the length of our grid of our jagged array. So let's use grid length. So this is the number of rows, and grid 0. So row 0 length. So this is the number of columns. Okay, we should probably create a placeholder for this class tile base value. So let's do it now. Let's go to Unity, create new C# tile base value. Be sure to copy the name that you have used in the script, make things easier. And we can make it, open it, and inherit a IValue interface. And because we are not yet inside the namespace, let's make a namespace. Let's place it in wave function collapse namespace. This way we have the IValue. And this will be the IValue of tile base. And we need to use Unity engine tilemaps. Delete the content. And last thing is implement the interface. You can see that we have quite a lot of methods to implement. Let's save the class and let's get back to input reader. Okay. Let's finish implementing this method. So here we will simply loop through the grid that we have read from the tile input, and we will create a new grid of tile base values placeholders. So let's loop the grid for I in grid length, and we can rename I to rows or row, and for this will be columns. And grid dot 0 length for column number. We will call grid of values row column equals new tile base value, and we will pass it value. So we will need to create a constructor in our tile base value. So we will pass grid row column. So let's use Alt Enter, generate constructor in tile base value. Great. And now we return our grid of values that we have filled with placeholders. Return of values. Okay, we will split the video here as we have a little bit more code to write, so we will continue in the next one. See you there.